All right, David, welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. I'm so glad to be having a conversation with you this evening on our side, and I believe it's early morning your side.
We're doing well. We've just come from Christmas, and before we got on, I was telling you I have three little boys, or they're not as little as they used to be, and so that's a lot of fun when you know, Christmas with little kids. And but they're finally back at school, which my wife and I are breathing a major sigh of relief. So,
Brilliant.
I'm actually thrilled to be talking to Australians because we've been binging Australian television. I think because of the actor strike here in America, they're putting a lot of Australian television in front of Americans right now.
Right.
So we watched this show called Colin from Accounts, and then we watched a show called The Heart Guy, which I guess is Doctor or something like that. So anyway, I feel like my dreams are going to be with Australian accents from here on forward.
That's great. Sounds like they're sending all the good shows over to you guys.
Yeah, I haven't heard any of those shows, so that's interesting to me.
No Neighbours or something like that. It's just the good.
Yeah.
It's all the good shows. Awesome. Well, just for our listeners, you mentioned you're married and you have three boys. Maybe just by way of introduction, you can share a bit more about your personal life, some hobbies that you're interested in, and then also would love to hear about the Mockingbird Ministries as well and how that all came into fruition.
Sure. Well, I live in Central Virginia in the States, and though I was brought up in New York and lived abroad quite a bit as a kid, my father was a theologian, and I have two brothers. But so I hobbies-wise, I have a lot of hobbies. Those who can see the video know that I have a big action figure collection. I'm a collector. I collect comic books, and I collect baseball cards, and I collect books, and I just have always been a sort of a pack rat in that respect. And as I've gotten older, all of my sort of collectibles have been outlawed to my office. So my office has become a very eccentric place to work. So sometimes if I want to write, I have to leave it because there's so much fun stuff around.
It distracts you too much?
Distracts me too much, but I'm a bit of a culture vulture and enjoy, taking in all sorts of media. And my wife's an artist, so spent the break. We went to a couple museums and watched a lot of movies. And I also have found as I've gotten older, and this is not very exciting, but if you put a puzzle in front of me, a jigsaw puzzle, it's almost like I go into automated mode or something like that. I can't get up until it's finished. So I've just spent the last 2 weeks, I completed a couple puzzles.
Nice.
So I'm an exerciser. We live in a very beautiful part of the country, which is with a lot of interesting terrain. So we do a lot of outdoors hiking and things like that. But you asked about Mockingbird. With my day job is that I run Mockingbird Ministries, and that is a nonprofit. Today is called a platform for connecting the message about the grace of God, which I just call the Christian gospel, to the cares and concerns of everyday life, with a real emphasis on grace and its kind of widespread and radical depth and applicability and just urgency in the life of the world and the life of the church. So that we started it's been around for 16 years,
Nice.
which feels like an eternity in internet time.
It is.
Yeah, so I've watched a lot of things come and go, but of course it's not that long. But we do podcasts ourselves. I run a podcast called The Mockingcast, and published books. I've written a couple I know we're going to talk about today. But we host conferences, and we publish a print magazine, and we have a very active website, and just provide a lot of different resources for people interested in the intersection of grace and culture. And so
Very
yeah,
good.
but I also I work part time at our church here. It's an Episcopal church, or I guess you would call it an Anglican church. And I'm a preacher here. I'm not ordained. I'm not a ordained person, but I have I'm what's called a licensed lay preacher in
Okay.
the Diocese of Virginia. So I run our adult education at our church. So I wear a number of different hats, and I worked with college students for about 15 years here, because Charlottesville, where I live, is where the University of Virginia is, where Thomas Jefferson founded, which is a pretty big.
So lots of history there, I can imagine.
It's in an American context, it's a lot of history.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Or in Australian context, it's probably like, what would you say, millennials of history?
Yeah.
I know. I guess Australia's the same. That you guys have the same frontier mentality where everything's about anything that's over 100 years old is ancient. So
It is. It all
That's
gets
true.
heritage listed, and you can't do anything to it.
Not too far from the
know.
truth.
Yeah. So, tell us about. I'm curious to know. You've been doing Mockingbird Ministries for 15 years, and the online landscape, I can imagine, has drastically changed in that time. What have you noticed about it?
What's interesting, there's been a spate of articles written about how the internet's no fun anymore. I don't think that's true. I don't think it was. I think it's always been a strange mix of like unbelievably toxic content and unbelievably hilarious and inventive, insanity. I mean, I love the internet. I also think it's the worst thing that's ever happened. But I mean, so I think we can hold both of those things in our minds. As far as it relates to what's changed, I mean, Mockingbird was born in what, looking back, was kind of the blogging boom that I think is done, is long since done, and people get. We've watched the way that people connect with online content has shifted pretty dramatically.
Right.
And podcasts, for Mockingbird, for example, our front door for our organization used to be our website, and now it's very much our banner podcast. And that's a rebalancing. I think that social media, as we've seen, for all of its liabilities and it's the damage it does, it does seem to be where people live. It's a shifting center of gravity, Yesterday's Twitter is today's X, and TikTok is where a lot of people seem to live these days, and Instagram, and Facebook still remains this kind of behemoth in the background, kind of controlling everything. So
Right.
we've watched how you've had to shift along with social media. So it used to be that you would put something on Facebook and everyone who followed you on Facebook would see it. And now if you don't, pay to promote something on Facebook, only a small fraction of the people that actively follow you will see it. So that's
Right.
a deeply frustrating reality, but it's also, I try to see the opportunities involved here, because, none of this stuff has to be, it's kind of a real privilege that I could connect with the two of you, for example, over a conference call early in the morning here, or late at night where you are, and we could find affinity and connection over shared interests and convictions. So, but yeah, that is a deeply, it's a moving target, and the amount of noise generated by is in the kind of religious sphere. I haven't seen much change in the actual tenor of the conversation. Like, I find it's you get people who are anger sells. Anger gets the clicks. So
Right. Yeah.
if you want to drive traffic, you have to appeal to people's baser instincts, which Mockingbird has sort of resolutely refused to do, probably to our detriment. But I also know that people appreciate over time that there's a place they can go that's not going to be clickbait, or at least going to be somewhat reserved about being in your face about why these people are wrong or why these people are right. It's so I don't know. I try, maybe naively continue to hold out hope that we can create a better, more gracious space online.
I love that.
Yeah, it's fantastic, David. I think it's some very cool things that you guys are doing at Mockingbird Ministries. And as you were talking about the vision of Mockingbird on the message of the grace of God, the gospel message, and analysing culture and discerning where the gospel applies in different cultural settings, I just think you're the perfect person to have on this podcast, because we love having those types of conversations. So how about we jump into chatting about your book, Low Anthropology, the unlikely key to a gracious view of others and yourself. And I'm not just saying this, David, because we've got you on the podcast. Very easy to say, because that is the case. But I really did enjoy this book, and I thought it was really helpful in unpacking human nature in a very realistic way. And so thank you for that. That word, anthropology, it's a big word. A lot of our listeners are probably familiar with it, some maybe not as much. What is kind of your working definition of anthropology, just as a helpful framer of the conversation?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Jared, right? Did I say that right? Okay. I almost called you Caleb, because that's the name that they're telling me at the bottom of the screen. Jared, thank you so much for that question. I think anthropology, many people who go to university think of anthropology as the study of how cultures are formed and how they are made. And that is cultural anthropology. Anthropology, the way that I'm using it, the way that theologians and philosophers use it, is kind of whatever your operating view of human nature is. So everyone has an anthropology. Everyone has something they mean when they say, I'm only human, or when they use the phrase that's dehumanizing, or that's deeply humanizing. Any time you're referring to implicit or sort of semi-conscious presumptions about what human beings are like, and what we're good at, what we're not good at, what we're capable of, incapable of, etc. You are making an anthropological claim. And so my sense is that despite the kind of, $3 word, it's actually shorthand for simply what we mean when we say human. And so
very good.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so diving into your book then, Low Anthropology, why did you feel the need to write it, and what was the motivation behind it?
There's several things. So first of all, I'm in my work with Mockingbird. What much of what we do is we pay attention, and we sort of see where anxiety and fear and kind of despair is popping up on a popular level. The kind of, how can we trace the spiritual, I would just call it the spiritual landscape, or the various phenomena that seem to afflict people. And so when I was preparing to write this book, it seemed like everyone was talking about a couple different things. They were talking about burnout a lot, and we were talking about loneliness a lot, and we were talking about anxiety a lot, and despair. And so when you drill down and they sort of talk about why are people so burned out, why are people so lonely, and there's also a little bit more 5-6 years ago, but it's still there. Perfectionism is a major source of cultural anxiety, and the kind of feeling that I have to do everything well and constantly be grinding and performing. So I felt like that at the base of a lot of these cultural and what I would call spiritual factors, that there was an anthropology that had sort of was wreaking havoc, a view of human nature that was simply false and destructive. Ideas about what human beings are like, which were not borne out in our reality and our lived experience. And I felt as a Christian, I could draw on the resources of our faith in a way that might actually be helpful and bring to bear compassion and space and grace, for a world that is kind of swallowing itself.
Right.
So that was I guess first and foremost, it was a sensitivity to the spiritual conditions of the world that I felt were just not abstract, but acute and the source of pain. And as a sensitive person, I was dealing with them myself, and the internal voices of more, you're not enough, never stop, and whether that be even in the religious realm. Mm-hmm. That was part of it. The second part was, I'm a Christian involved in what I would call public witness. I'm interested in making Christianity, and what lies on my heart is how to translate or make the faith that I find to be such a wellspring of life and light. How do you make that emotionally and intellectually, or intellectually and emotionally intelligible? Not just plausible, but intelligible to people who, by and large, have ceased being able to, have got too much baggage, or there's huge amounts of resistance to hearing what the Bible has to say about various things. And some of that's understandable, some of it's totally irrational and silly, but whatever the case may be, that's what I think I'm if God has given me any kind of passion or gifting, it's to try to make the gospel intelligible to modern people. And so I don't think you can really understand. The question is always like, why would someone want to believe, or what would lead someone to believe in God in the first place? And before you even get to a gracious God, as revealed in Jesus Christ, like why, I want people to be like, because I'm out there in the world and I live in a very, I guess you could call it, here we would call it a blue state context, but a kind of a post-Christian part of America. And the question is very, very much, I don't think Australia is that different, but why would someone find this of comfort in the first place? And so that I want to get further back from the kind of, there is a God, the sort of Nicene Creed kind of, what would lead a person to want to say that or to find that to be of immense value? So I think you have to begin with understandings of yourself and human nature. So that's what led me to write it. That's awesome.
Fantastic. And one of the things I really enjoyed, or the question that you just ended off with there, you say that any discussion of who we are or what God is must begin with an accurate representation of who we think we are. And I think that's what you're saying, is we have to understand who we are in relation to God, and what our place is in this cultural moment that we live in. Do you mind explaining that a bit further?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's from within the religious world, there's an anxiety about overemphasizing human need and felt, angst or pain. because we don't want to create God in our own image, right? That's an anxiety that I think is legitimate, but it's possibly overplayed. I want to. I think it's important to drill down on the universal aspects of human experience that would lead the gospel to be such good news to people. So, I guess. When I say that any understanding of God has to begin with an understanding of ourselves, if I say Jesus Christ is a savior, like, what does that mean to someone who doesn't feel they need saving? That doesn't mean anything to someone who doesn't feel that salvation is even on the table as something of a viable. Something that's exciting. You have to kind of talk about the human predicament as people that are in need of saving. What does that look like? Well, people don't like to hear that. Don't make me feel bad about myself. Well, at the same time, no one seems to ever balk at forgiveness when it's related to themselves, or mercy, the desire for mercy. We don't want to say all human beings need forgiveness because we're so fallen from grace, but in the specific, we can say there have been times in my own life where I have failed to live with integrity and any kind of righteousness. And that has caused immense damage in my life and the life of the people around me. And I need a solution, some sort of solution that I cannot seem to generate on my own steam. That is something that people, generally speaking, I find are very open to. They get nervous when you make large claims about human beings being sort of wicked and in need of Amazing Grace, how sweet this. Think about it. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. People love that. That saved a wretch like me. Whoa, wretch! I'm not a wretch. Don't tell me I'm a wretch. And yet, the lived experience of many of us is that we suspect that we are in fact wretched in certain ways, and that we have behaved wretchedly, and that other people, we certainly know how they've behaved wretchedly towards us, and we know how the wretchedness works out on a global scale. But all that to say, like, you can't. I don't find it be very convincing to make claims about God if you don't, if you're speaking into a void of if human beings are just sort of good people making healthy choices, and we maybe need a little bit of an example, or a little bit of a coaching from above or from one another. Then the whole religious project is a very lame and unexciting one to me. But if human beings are their own worst enemies, and we are stuck in traps of our own devising, then all of a sudden the news that on Christmas, for example, that God would come down, that that there'd be a rescue, God would be the great rescuer, not just the helper, but the rescuer of humanity, then all of a sudden I find some emotional traction with that idea.
Yeah, that's great. Hey, David, one of the things that you helpfully do throughout the book is make this contrast between low anthropology and high anthropology, and the fruit of those different systems or concepts, of realities, really. How would you describe the difference between low anthropology and high anthropology?
As I said earlier, I guess anthropology is your view of human nature. So if you have a very optimistic view of human nature, that's what I would call high anthropology. That tends to be the view that is that makes us feel good about ourselves, and you got this. It's a kind of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, it can be very inspiring in the short term, high anthropology. And I use Steve Jobs as an example of sort of, you already know where your life wants to take you. Life is a manner of sort of getting in touch with your inner strength and inner drive, and kind of, actualizing. And you have it within yourself to do all these things. And that sounds great, especially when you're 21 and 22, and it's very flattering, and it's what most of the time, it's what most of us sort of the air we breathe. A low anthropology says that in fact, it's not so simple. Your instincts often lead you astray. The Christian would use the Jeremiah verse about the heart is deceitful above all things, but you could simply, I use the Anne Lamott quote in there, which I think is the best version of low anthropology, and it highlights why this is actually of good news. And she says, everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared, even those who you think have it more or less together. They're far more like you than you would care to believe. So try not to compare your insides with their outsides. That's a low anthropology view, and it's not flattering. It's not what I want my 7-year-old to come back from first grade saying about himself. And yet, I find when I hear it, I find it an unburdening, and it actually produces an energy and patience and hope and unity, connection, in a way that all of the high anthropology appeals to the willpower and inner beauty simply doesn't create that same degree of connection. So does that trace the distinction well enough? And I would want to say, like, in my view, a low anthropology is a euphemism for a biblical anthropology. I'm trying to use, and I draw upon Augustine a lot in the book. That said, there are plenty of Christian spheres that you would walk into and they would have a very high anthropology. And that usually has to do with how they view what happens when a person becomes a Christian. Are you sort of imbued with moral superpowers, or do you remain a person who is sort of utterly dependent on God to do the growing?
That's a great point. Sorry.
No.
I was just that's a great point that you make, is like becoming a Christian shouldn't give you a superiority complex by any means, because in actual reality you become more aware of your brokenness and more aware of your sinfulness and more aware of your need for grace. So it should actually draw you closer to humanity than having this superiority complex now that I've got something over everyone else. It's actually, I can actually see my brokenness through a lens that we're all broken and we're all in need of this grace and of the Savior Jesus. So I love that point you make. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how having a low anthropology humanizes and dignifies a person.
Yes, this is the great question, because people think oftentimes I've had people read the book and they're afraid at the front end that I'm going to make them feel badly about themselves, undermine human dignity, and that I just don't think anyone who's actually read the book feels that way. I think that's the way that the doctrine of sin, for example, has been misused and weaponized, as to use the modern word, in Christian contexts and sort of Christian cultural context, makes people very wary of that language. And yet we love talking about vulnerability and leading with weakness, and these are sort of cultural buzzwords that people are fine with, because that's what vulnerability is. It's just sort of a euphemism for weakness and openness. So how does a low anthropology? Well, how does it support the dignity of human beings? Well, in no sense does a low anthropology say that you are kind of bad. It does say that we are inheritors of sin, that everyone is that there is a dark side to human nature. But the truth is, if you don't have some sense that there's a dark side of human nature, you actually start to hate people. Because you start to divide the world into good people and bad people, and low anthropology says there is no meaningful distinction between good people and bad. They're good things, and they're good. They're good. There's goodness, and there's badness. But as it relates to people, we are all far gone from original righteousness, is how the Book of Common Prayer puts it. So a high anthropology, actually, it says sort of there is this theoretical world in which I could do it all, be it all, have it all, care about it all, sort of get it together. And therefore, life becomes a perpetual falling short and an actual treadmill of self-loathing, because you get the sense everyone else has it to sort of is further along, and I'm just lagging behind all the time. That is actually the beginning point of an undignified way of viewing the human race, that views you as uniquely screwed up and fallen. A low anthropology says, in fact, the only reason you think other people are more together is that you don't know them very well. And that it also says everyone has been given enormous gifts and different gifts, and God is the creator, and He doesn't create junk, as they say. But the great beauty of being alive is that no one has the same exact gifts, and so the language we have in the Bible is of a body that has different parts, and that not everyone is the hands or the feet or the elbows or something like that, and so we need each other. This is low anthropology basically says that you and I are in need of help from one another, but ultimately from God, and we need deliverance from God. So it looks to other people as partners, collaborators, friends, and as people as who have incredibly valuable gifts to share, which means it begins from the point of humility, and anytime humility and dignity are not at odds with each other, and somehow we've gotten into a place where we think they are. Humility is an accurate assessment of one's own limitations and fallibilities that leads to sympathy, as well as collaboration and friendship. And it is not somehow a detesting one another for your lack. So I guess, I don't know if that's, low anthropology is not at odds with a kind of people being created in the image of God. It's just much more that we all have been given different gifts, but very similar weaknesses. And that the only way that flourishing happens on a human level is through an accurate assessment of who we are, which is usually humility, which is the birthplace of love and service and a desire to help other people and not immediately judge them for not being as good as you are.
Yeah, I think that's a really important clarification, that low anthropology doesn't diminish the inherent worth and dignity of humans at all. And you do talk within your book, though, David, and you kind of alluded to it there, how an improperly applied low anthropology can and has led to shame, self-loathing for people. Can you unpack how low anthropology can be misapplied and result in those bad fruits, if you like?
Sure. Oftentimes what people, there's a couple different things here that I would tease out here. That, first of all, low anthropology always involves an embrace of uncertainty. High anthropology thrives on certainty. It says, I know for certain that this is right and this is wrong. And a low anthropology always begins from the point of view is that I do not, as a limited creature, confined by space and time. I do not have access to all of the facts. And so any judgment I might make, it cannot be watertight. And so that is very important in our world, that we do not have. We live in a time of competing certainties where people think that they have full access to the truth. And a low anthropology says that only God has full access to the truth, and you do not. So I think it creates a sort of, a little space there for it. Doesn't undermine rightness and wrongness, but it does sort of give us a little pause before completely throwing someone into outer darkness. But wait, so remind me what the question was. I don't know how I got to that.
So there's one point that you make a couple of times during your book, and you link it also to the religion section, how an improperly applied low anthropology can often result in shame, self-loathing, and worthlessness. How is low anthropology misapplied in those settings, do you think, and how do you combat that?
Yeah, so what I would say is that part of that, the reason I talked about certainty just now, is that that's actually a high anthropology. When I tell you, you stink and there's nothing good about you and there's no use trying, that is actually a high anthropology in disguise. That's me saying, I know, I can write the script for you, and there's you're terrible, right? A low anthropology always holds out space for surprise because it holds out space for God. And sort of, it's more of a smallness than a badness, I guess you could say. But in religious perspective, what is often the case is you hear you are not enough, or you are incapable of goodness, and you are in desperate need of God's forgiveness. And these are the things we communicate, which I think are true. But then it adds to that an idea about agency, which is a very high anthropology idea, which is that, okay, so stop being that way. Stop it. You've got to, like, you're a sinner, now stop being a sinner. Batten down the hatches. Whatever you do, don't do the thing that you're naturally inclined to. And that creates, because it's founded on a high anthropology view of that, basically, if I just know what the right thing to do is, I can do it. That is not a low anthropology. A low anthropology says I'm actually tied in knots of according to all sorts of circumstances in biology and things I have no control over, but telling someone what to do and them doing it is a very different thing. So I think a religion that emphasizes sin but doesn't understand that the will is bound, that we need God's mercy and help in terms of any kind of change in life, that then it will turn into an engine of self-loathing, because it basically pits a person in a battle against themselves that they cannot win. A low anthropology says you are limited, you are doubled, meaning you're very conflicted. You're not just a straight line of knowing what to do and doing it, but you also do have a dark side that is very real. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand the world, the headlines, yourself, your loved ones. But it doesn't say that you are therefore the solution. It says God is the solution. So a low anthropology without a belief in God can be a sort of a nihilistic view, a cynical view, but a low anthropology that puts its hope in God to be the change agent, the source of light and life and hope and energy and creativity, well, that means anything can happen. And that, the great question of the low anthropologist is, like, given what I'm like, given what other people are like, given what the media is like, given what the politicians are like, how is it that so many great things are on offer? Look at all the beauty that God has still invested in the world. Look at how the love that I've been shown by this person who is in many ways just as wounded as I am. How miraculous and awe-inspiring is that? That is the exciting proposition of being alive as a low anthropologist, as you sort of move through the world with awe and wonder at all of the goodness, but without being completely, without holding the world in contempt for not being better than it is, while being surprised and almost inspired by the fact that it could be, that there's so much goodness that's here for the taking.
Brilliant. And it's even not holding the world to contempt for it not being better, but holding that standard to yourself as well, that you don't have contempt against yourself for, like what you're saying, not being better. And I think you talk a bit about this in terms of like with burnout and how it's often got to do with inflated assumptions or expectations that we put on ourselves, which, I think it seems like it's becoming more and more of I would say, like a prominent thing within our Western cultures, people struggling with this thing called burnout or fatigue. Why in your research and your studies, why do you think that is?
Well, fatigue, anytime you hear these phrases, and fatigue, by the way, has replaced burnout, I think, as the predominant way we talk about stuff, but it's the same thing. It's not exhaustion. Right. It's just sort of a core exhaustion of living in a world that asks too much of you. There's a world that won't stop accelerating, that is always, how will 2024 be better than 2023, or how will you beat despite everything going to hell in a handbasket, still you're going to be skinnier and more productive this year than ever before, and like a better husband and a better father.
Sounds good to me.
With a bigger bank account and stuff like that. I mean, that's that growth. Every time you hear the phrase growth mindset. Yeah, that is the poison,
right.
Because it makes life into a competition to be won that is fundamentally at odds with the truth of our lives, which they end in the grave. Spend some time with some older people. It's a very 20s and 30s mindset to have, a growth mindset. And people would hear that and they'd be like, oh, you don't want to improve things. Of course you want to improve things, but not out of this neurotic, nonstop, always on performative cycle that is making us all extremely unhappy.
Yeah.
And
so New Year's resolutions, where do they sit with you?
If they can be approached from, I used to be anti-resolutions in all forms, but I think if you can approach them from the perspective of sort of a playfulness and kind of a hopefulness, like here's something that would be fun, and a prayerfulness, like God, if this is sort of where I would love to improve, and I'm going to hold it lightly, but it's not going to be some kind of ironclad measure of oneself. So I think that the reason resolutions are something to be sort of criticized is that it's reflective of a larger self-help culture that is very defeatist. I think I said it earlier, but I quote a friend in there. But it's not defeatist. People get, oh, you're saying it's defeat. It's not defeatist to say, I can't pull it off, or I can't do it all, be it all. What's defeatist is to say I can, but I just haven't pulled it off yet. That's the defeatist. That's when people feel like they're uniquely to blame for the ills of the world, and they themselves are the problem. I don't know how we got here, but resolutions. It's tricky. Playfulness. Hold it lightly. Have a sense of humor about it.
I love it.
Here are the things I'm going to do for the next 3 weeks, and then we'll see how far it goes after that.
Yeah.
Well, related to what you're saying there, David, I think it plays in nicely. You talk about the 3 pillars of low anthropology in your book as limitation, as doubleness, and as self-centeredness as well. And I particularly enjoyed the chapter on doubleness. It really resonated with me, as I think it would a lot of people who read it. And I just thought of that Romans 7 reality that we live in immediately when I started reading the chapter, and then you go on to reference that particular scripture where the Apostle Paul says, you know, I don't do the things I want to do, and the things I hate I do. And Augustine talks about us having disordered loves and disordered desires, and I think we can all honestly admit, when we're being realistic with ourselves, that that's the environment that we swim in, that we live in. One of the stories that I found particularly humorous that you used in your book was around the American Nutrition Association, something like that. I'm not sure what they're called. You can correct me. How they decided a little while back they were going to put the amount of calories on each food items you were ordering, with the hope that that would improve the health and well-being of Americans. And the thought process being, if people have the right information, things will all be good. But can you let us know what actually happened?
Excuse me. Yeah, this happened in New York City when I was living there. All of a sudden, all the fast food restaurants, you couldn't read their menus because it was covered in calorie counts. And the idea was to reduce sort of diabetes and public health and reduce obesity in America. Make sure people knew exactly what they were consuming, and the data came in, and it turns out people ate far more than they did the opposite of what was intended. And it was reflective of a Romans 7, people ordered more bad food when they knew what they were doing, and it was there were a couple different things going on there, in that we think in life the problem with bad behavior, with misbehavior, and this comes to ourselves and other people, that we think that the real issue has to do with information and education, but the real problem is always motivation and capacity, agency. Its problem is the wherewithal, not information. So generally speaking, most people know that they shouldn't be having that, third beer or that, second burger. The problem is that they want it. They're doing all sort of inner calculus to sort of how can they feel okay about still eating it.
How can they justify it? Yeah.
How they can justify it. And so doubleness in that chapter, I mean, I'm very proud of that chapter. I think addiction is the great, is one of the great, lenses through which to view the world and oneself. And I think it's very biblical. When you boil down to it, being enslaved to sin is very, very, any kind of time you get into that deeply distressing language in Paul's letters, you're actually, if you just think about addiction or something that defies your willpower's, your ability to control it, and that could be depression or grief, then you're in the realm of doubleness. So I think that's but at the heart of that is that basically in our lives, our appetites are calling the shots, our hearts, our minds are lagging behind. And this is confirmed by all sorts of social science, but Christians theoretically knew this a long, long time ago, that it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, and that it is we have the issues in life, the real. There are cases where someone says, "Oh, hey, shave up your face rather than down," and okay, done, I can do that. But if someone says, "Be happy instead of sad," that's a completely different thing. Or have faith instead of be fearful. That's the real problems in life boil down to the places where we know what we should do and we don't seem to be able to do it. So that's what doubleness accounts for, and I think it's where the gospel speaks very loudly to people who cannot seem to, who are driven by their desires, which are, as Augustine says, are kind of they're God-given, but they're disordered as a result of the fall. And so we love certain things too much and other things too little or in the wrong order. We love the yeah.
So how much, I read a book recently, I think it was by a guy named James K. Smith, You're What You Love, and he talks about cultural liturgies. I'm curious to know what your thought is. How much of our environment shapes our desires, and I suppose creates this disorderedness in our lives, and how much is it within, I suppose, our own nature?
Well, I love that book. I like Jamie does really good work. James K. Smith. I think he's and a lot of people would have said, "Oh, you sound just like him," which I take as a huge compliment.
Your book was far more palatable in terms of. I think that's what you're aiming for as well. Is like not that academia, not that like low level, but it's like that pastoral heart coming through with that academia backing. Yeah, it was
That's
great.
what I want. I want to speak to actual people. Not that Jamie doesn't. There's no contrast here. But yes, thank you for saying that. I take that as a
just
as a
different
deeper
audiences,
compliment.
right?
Yeah, I think for the most part, and I doubt he would disagree with this, the cultural liturgies we create are reflective of internal realities. We create them for a reason. They're not thrust upon us. It's just like when people say, the culture made me do so, or something like that. It's like, well, you are the culture. Like, the culture is, or this such and such institution is the problem. It's like, well, human beings created that institution. Like, it's not somehow this free-floating reality that has been thrust upon you. All of these things are, that doesn't mean there aren't some systems that are better than others, or some cultural liturgies that I think can nudge us in different, and form us in different ways. But for the most part, the real, I would resist any, and this is my faith, this is motivated by my faith, and the words of Jesus, but I would resist any attempt to locate the problems outside of the human heart, because those problems are born out of the human heart, and they're just, and I talk about in the book, I think, like, this is why we need each other. This is why, the scientific method was Francis Bacon, who was so skeptical of human reason. He was a staunch Calvinist, from what I understand, that he said we need as many people as possible to double check and to, experiment, and do the same experiments over and over. And scientific progress, to the extent it's going to happen really slowly. But we have him to thank for all of the technological progress. It's that slow. And talk about, again, there you have human beings capable of enormous acts of innovation and insight and progress. But it had to be, we did it in tandem with as many, accounting for our blind spots as possible. So there are such a thing as a good system and a bad system. I talk about surveillance capitalism as, I think, a particularly bad system that we've almost fallen into by mistake. It was designed by a couple of 20-somethings in the West Coast, and the algorithms they designed. But I think that there is such a good. I think this is why the liturgies of the church are. The older you get, the more you realize how profound they are, because they always put the onus on God. They always sort of bring people back to a sense of humility, week in, week out, every single time. They always end with a sort of appeal to God to do the growing, to God to do the gifting, to God to do the grace, to bring to bear the Spirit of God in all sorts of interesting ways. That's what a good liturgy does. And so I wouldn't say, so I don't want to say liturgies are created equal, but I also don't want to sort of blame them all for our problems, or professional sports or something. Those are, if we focus on those, we are almost always ignoring the log in our own eye.
Yeah. And it goes back to that, what you talk about, that doubleness it's something that we've actually created ourselves, and something we participating in ourselves. So yeah, it's sort of, you have to reflect inwardly on it. Yeah.
Absolutely. David, you're suggesting that adopting a low anthropology is highly liberating for us as humanity. So why do you think the human heart is so resistant to it?
Well, a variety of reasons. I think that the primary one is control. We want to be in control, and we gravitate towards any system that grants us control. And life of being out of control is simply too frightening for a human being, even those who believe in God. And so we will do anything we can to sort of maintain. And a high anthropology can work for a little while your body is working well, while you're sort of still, your elasticity of your mind is still open enough that you can learn new things. Like, there are ways in which it can be inspiring to it's great when, the Christianity, I've always felt, doesn't have much to say to people who are kind of whose reach has never exceeded their grasp, or his grasp has never exceeded their reach. It has a lot to say to you when you're in prison, or when you can't stop drinking, or when you can't seem to get along with your spouse, or your relationship with your parents seems to just be impervious to improvement. So I want to not outlaw any kind of like the attempt at excellence or achievement or sort of striving is a good thing. And I think if it's born out of the gifts that God has given you, moving you towards wanting to serve other people, like, go for it. But without a sense, when it becomes a neurotic project about justifying yourself, saving yourself, that's when things get really dark, and despair really enters the picture in a profound way. I don't know if I've even addressed your question.
Oh, you perfectly have. Great.
Just aware of the time, Dave. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed particularly that comparison between what a high anthropology is and a low anthropology, a high being one that essentially alienates you from people, and the low anthropology is something that, with humility and curiosity, forges communities together. I think it's so helpful, especially navigating these cultural moments that we find ourselves in, a helpful book to have. And it sort of brings to awareness, well, we actually need to look at our own hearts. You mentioned before, take the log out of our own eyes before we start judging other people. So it's a really good book. If people are wanting to buy the book, find out more about you, your work, where would you send them to?
Oh, thank you. Well, the book's available anywhere you can buy books. Amazon, of course, is the great big evil empire, but they certainly know how to ship a book quickly. It's available there. If you like it, read it and review it. Barnes & Noble here in the States, but it's also available on all the independent channels as well. Mockingbird is where most of my work is based, and that our website is mbird.com, mbird.com. The Mocking Cast is the podcast I do every 2 weeks with a couple of people, and our journal is called The Mockingbird.
Awesome.
Picking up on a theme here, but there's all sorts of ways. Unfortunately, with the way that postage has developed in the last few years, it's very difficult to send stuff to Australia with our magazine, but we've thought of some creative ways to get it to people over there. But there's all sorts of ways to... the book's in paperback now. It came out in hardcover. And just I'm just grateful you guys have me on. It's so nice to sort of speak to what feels like a fresh audience.
Yeah, and I'm sure our audience will love your insight and perspective, and yeah, we'd definitely love to have you on again, have another conversation, and I think it's always helpful having a mind and an eye who can culturally analyze what's happening from a gospel perspective and see how the gospel can shape and is shaping our lives if we just become aware of that in this cultural setting. So thanks so much for your time, Dave. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Good on you,
Thank
Dave.
you, Caleb. Thank you, Jared. I really appreciate you guys having me on.
Too easy.